How is everybody doing? Welcome back to another episode of The Banker Next Door. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Berquist. Today we are continuing the Lords of Easy Money series. This is episode 19, and we are going to be covering the final chapter of the book, chapter 16. I can't believe we've made it all the way here to the very end here. So as we get started here, I'm going to bring in our trusty PowerPoint presentation, and very quickly I'm going to go over here what happened in chapter 15. So if anybody didn't see last episode, chapter 15, we basically start out in the heart of the pandemic. We're in early 2020. We're basically March, April 2020. The pandemic has hit full bore. Financial panic everywhere, and now we have kind of the response from the Fed and the Treasury and Congress, and we get into all that here. So Steve Mnuchin, who is the head of the Treasury, he kind of comes in. We learn about kind of the friendship between him and Powell and how they worked very closely together. They worked very well together. And then we got into how Congress basically just wasn't working. They either weren't working together. Every idea from one side was getting shot down by the other. They finally did pass some kind of a relief bill, but it was just it was nowhere near to what they needed to do to happen. So the Fed kind of comes in with a whole new bailout. They bring it. They want to do a whole bunch of things. They create they bring back something that they had used during the financial crisis called the SPV, the Special Purpose Vehicle. They created this whole thing where the SPV would be created as a joint company between them and the Treasury, and basically the Treasury would put in some taxpayer money, and then the the Fed would use that through the SPV to lend the money out. And then they cap this all off with just basically another giant splash of QE that would be there to basically pump money at basically no end. And they pumped more money in 30 days than they had done in 300 years, that they would have done in 300 years prior to 2008, which is just you can't even fathom it. You literally can't fathom it. And the Fed basically announces the rescue package. They basically didn't wait for Congress because Congress kind of couldn't get their act together. And then they talked about, who benefited from this. Well, obviously the big banks, hedge funds, private equity, the very richest Americans, anybody who owned assets, who owned stock, who owned, some of these big corporations, the bankers and everybody that had these CLOs out there, the people in the bond market, they're the ones who benefited from all this. And then finally, Congress gets their butt in gear and they pass the CARES Act, and they get that through. And then, but that goes through, and that is not without its criticism. And Steve Mnuchin comes back and basically tries to make the case for, I would rather instead of the ideally perfect program, I would rather have just a realistically good one. So in other words, we couldn't wait for it to be perfect because we didn't have time for that. So we had to put out the one that we thought was at least realistically good. So now, after all this is done, the Fed, ironically, now they're worried about their image. They're worried about helping out, bailing out everybody on Wall Street and all the hedge funds and all of the 1% and making them all, continuing to make them all stupid rich by continuously bailing them out and putting in asset inflation, which is just actually making them richer, and yet doing nothing of any kind to help the poor, the middle class. They're a little worried that people were going to be kind of upset with this view of the Fed, and that they might be just a little bit upset that the Fed hadn't done anything to help them. So then the Fed tries to point toward the Main Street lending program. And the Main Street lending program was a disaster. It did not work, didn't help anybody. It kind of blew up in their face. And then we get into talking about the real bailout. There was kind of two sides to this equation. On the finance side, on the Wall Street side, that hummed like a purr of a V8 engine from a 1965 Ford Mustang. That thing hummed and purred and roared right through, and no problem. On the other side, the bailout for people, for small businesses, for individuals, that was just a hot mess and didn't work all that great. And then we talked about Dave Portnoy, which I thought was kind of funny. How did he get in there? And then we got into kind of Robinhood, and we talked about Citadel and how Citadel works with Robinhood, and then we come down to at the end Powell's praise. His two bosom buddies in the world, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, the three of them all together, bosom buddies, all praising each other. They're just loving up on each other, and can't give each other enough praise for coming in to fix the problems that they created in the first place. It's like, wonderful thing. And then we capped it off with basically the bailout of 2020. And we talked about it, kind of surmised very nicely in the last two paragraphs, talking about the how this was so one-sided, how it bailed out all these people on Wall Street, bailed out all the hedge funds, the private equity people, and who it didn't bail out, didn't bail out Main Street, didn't help the little people, didn't help the little guy at all. So this thing was very, very uneven. So now we're going to begin to see a little bit of the ramifications of this here. So we're going to get in. So we're going to get into the final chapter now. Chapter 16 is called The Long Crash, covers the rest of 2020 and then 2021. So, and we're going to pick up here. If you remember from a few chapters ago, John Feltner, who was one of the workers over at Rexnord who had gotten laid off. And, so we're going to check in on John Feltner now and the American public. Like, how does this whole thing work for your regular everyday person? So after he was laid off from Rexnord, John Feltner was determined to keep his life on track. He and Nina was his wife. He and Nina had been planning for a long time to save up enough money to buy the house they rented near Silver Spoon Drive. The couple didn't seem willing to let go of that goal. In the first few months after he lost his factory job, Feltner bounced around between temporary gigs. He got a job doing maintenance work at a grocery store. He later got a contracting job also in maintenance. He had suspected that he wouldn't be able to find a steady job that paid as much as his unionized position at Rexnord. He was right. But he kept pressing, and he did eventually find a full-time position in the maintenance department of a big hospital. It paid less than Rexnord, but it was dependable. Nina had worked in the human resources department of a company that provided at-home mental health care. It took some time, but they did save up the money, and they did buy their house. Also, thanks to luck, they worked in healthcare, one of the few industries that weren't shut down or interrupted by the coronavirus pandemic. By the end of 2020, Feltner's workday started in the late afternoon. He started getting ready a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when he pulled out of his driveway and began his long commute. The quickest way to get to work took about 40 minutes. The first part of the route went along Interstate 70 toward Indianapolis, past a monotonous background of farmland that was wide open and empty during the long winter months. From there, the route went north on the big highway loop around the edge of the city to Community North Hospital, a large medical complex that looked like a self-contained office park. Feltner's shift ran from 3:30 in the afternoon till about 11:30 at night, when the complex was mostly quiet. The first COVID-19 case in Indiana was diagnosed at Community North on March 6th. By November, the state had about 200,000 cases and 5,000 deaths. Another 5,000 people would die in the state in the following couple of months. The whole thing made life surreal for people like Feltner. The hospital eventually set up a temporary tent facility in a parking lot to conduct drive-through testing for the virus, creating the feel of emergency barracks. Feltner wore a face mask during his entire shift. His social life slammed to a halt, and Nina set up a home office in an upstairs bedroom. The couple's daughter lived at home, although her healthcare job took her out of the house. The Feltners stopped seeing friends and heard through the rumor mill when their neighbors got sick. Feltner stayed very busy at work, which was a blessing in its way. People in the restaurant and hotel business would be out of work for months. Feltner belonged to the group of workers deemed essential, meaning that he didn't have the option to work from home at a safe distance from others. America's essential workers in 2020 put in very long hours and crisscrossed a largely abandoned landscape, delivering food, working at grocery store checkout counters, using their cars, staffing hospitals, and keeping factories and warehouses humming around the clock. They often did this at great personal risk, getting sick from COVID-19 at a far higher rate than workers who stayed at home. Feltner and Nina were among the fortunate. They never caught coronavirus, or at least didn't have any symptoms if they did. Neither did their daughter, even though her job took her on home visits to people who did have the virus. The federal bailouts did have a significant impact on the essential workers. Evictions were held at bay, and the emergency payments helped them meet bills. But the majority of the government's largesse bypassed places like the Feltner's neighborhood. The economic recovery of 2020 was a gated recovery, with the money flowing to selected, exclusive zip codes. The people who did very well, the people who did well did very well, but the rest did not. The Fed surveyed businesses with fewer than 500 employees and found that 90% of them were still suffering from a downturn in sales by the end of the year. About 30% of those companies said they would probably go out of business if they didn't get more federal aid. For Feltner, the bailouts were a marginal issue, something that didn't matter very much in his daily life. The one-time payments mailed out to everyone didn't do anything to arrest the much longer downward slide that defined the decades of Feltner's working life. Before the financial crisis, when he worked at the auto parts maker Navistar, Feltner earned about $80,000 a year, or more when overtime pay was included. At Rexnord, he earned about $60,000. At the hospital, he earned about $46,000. And at each job, his benefits had been scaled back and his health care costs had risen. He wasn't alone in this regard. The middle class had experienced a very long and deep slide in its earnings power, bargaining power, and wages. Virtually nothing had changed this trajectory during the decade between 2010 and 2020. The economy had grown, but the growth was captured by a smaller and smaller share of the population. Feltner and his neighbors weren't just excluded from the lion's share of the 2020 bailout, they had been excluded from the benefits of ZIRP and QE and the asset price inflation that those policies created. The entire bottom half of the U.S. population owned about 2% of all the nation's assets. The top 1% of the population owned 31%, and that's even higher today. This helped explain why the households in the very middle of America's income scale, meaning the middle 20%, saw their median net worth rise by only 4% between 1989 and 2016. 4%. During the same period, the net worth of people in the top 20% more than doubled. The wealth of the top 1% nearly tripled. Millions of people in the middle class were falling behind. To compensate for this fact, they took on loads of cheap debt, which helped them feel like they were at least remaining in place. Consumer debt hit $14 trillion in late 2019, a record level even after adjusting for inflation. The only good news seemed to be that interest rates on the debt were lower. Households were spending about 10% of their disposable income in servicing debt in 2019, which was down from 13% right before the global financial crisis. Now, Feltner was an optimistic guy by nature. He talked about the local boom in construction that seemed to be underway in 2020 and the fact that skilled trade workers were in such high demand. His daughter found work at a home healthcare aide as a home healthcare aide, and his two sons had also had full-time jobs doing maintenance work on vehicles for a local school district. Things were pretty good at the end of the day. One of Feltner's sons welcomed a new baby during the pandemic, which helped keep everyone's mind off the gloomier realities of what was going on. But Feltner also felt a nagging fear about his kids' future. All of them had started working when they were young, and they knew how to work hard and be dependable. But it wasn't clear anymore that hard work was a pathway to a dependable living or a stable life. Feltner didn't know if his kids could expect to earn even as much as he had earned. It scares the hell out of me. It really does, he said. It's almost like we've become the commodities ourselves. You know what I'm saying, Feltner said. I do know what he was saying. The value of workers had been diminished, but the value of other commodities was on the rise. The Fed was making sure of it. I'm going to say that last part again. The value of workers had been diminished, but the value of other commodities was on the rise, and the Fed was making sure of it. So, okay, now we're going to get into the bailout continues and asset inflation runs wild. Jay Powell had become a figure like the Wizard of Oz by December of 2020. To most people, Powell was a disembodied face that flickered on a large screen, delivering proclamations from on high. The Fed's press conferences were now held by video conference after each FOMC meeting. The choreographed events began with an image of Powell standing in front of a large blue curtain and reading scripted comments. When he was finished, Powell took questions from reporters who suddenly appeared on screen, each of them a small face framed with squares arranged in a large grid across the screen. The reporters were sitting in various home offices and apartments, and they spoke into awkwardly angled cameras. On December 16th, Powell made a big announcement. Some of the most important emergency measures the Fed had deployed during the spring would now be made semi-permanent. While the Main Street lending program was sputtering to a quiet end, other parts of the bailout would endure. The Fed would keep interest rates at zero and would now conduct $120 billion in quantitative easing every month for the foreseeable future. That was about a decade's worth of money creation at historic rates conducted every 30 days. Let me say that again. That was about a decade's worth of money creation at historic rates conducted every 30 days. It would continue, Powell said, until substantial further progress has been made toward healing the economy. When that might occur was anyone's guess. Powell said the Fed would continue to intervene as long as price inflation didn't rise above 2% for an extended period of time, an eventuality that he said was unlikely in the near future. The price of certain items had spiked because of supply disruptions, but weak growth and weak demand were smothering prices overall. Asset price inflation, however, was accelerating without restraint. The stock market was doing so well in December that it didn't even make sense to the people who were making money off of it. A web-based food delivery company called DoorDash went public that month, and its stock nearly doubled immediately. The online rental company Airbnb went public and its shares more than doubled. This might sound great for those companies, but when share prices jump so quickly, it means that the firm's original owners have lost out on a lot of money because they've priced their shares too low. A video game company called Roblox suspended its initial public offering in December as it tried to make sense of the market, according to the Wall Street Journal. The value of stock market shares was as high as any time since the dot-com boom when compared to actual company revenue. If that didn't make sense to people, then things weren't going to make sense for a long time. The market broke records and then broke them again in the months to come. The market for corporate debt was just as strong. By the end of 2020, companies issued more than $1.9 trillion in new corporate debt, beating the previous record that was set in 2017. Business for leveraged loans and CLOs was booming. American companies would carry this debt for many years to come because of the way it was structured. Companies had to either roll the debt. Remember, we've talked, that has been a repeating theme here. Roll the debt by selling it again or pay it in full when the loan expired. The corporate debt binge brought a new and troubling term into corporate America's lexicon, something called the zombie company. A zombie company was a firm that carried so much debt that its profits weren't enough to cover its loan costs. The only thing that kept zombie companies out of bankruptcy was the ability to roll their debt perpetually. During 2020, nearly 200 major publicly traded companies entered the ranks of the zombie army, according to analysis by Bloomberg News. These weren't just marginal or risky firms, but included well-known firms like Boeing, ExxonMobil, Macy's, and Delta Airlines. When Bloomberg analyzed 3,000 large public trading firms, it found that about 20% of them were zombies. These companies posed a risk beyond their own financial stability. Their existence suppressed economic productivity because they consumed investments and resources that might have gone to new firms or entrepreneurs. So let's take a time out for a second here. Let's talk about these zombie companies. So what did we just see the other day? We saw a company called Red Lobster Restaurant Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They had become a zombie company. Their debt, the debt load that they had taken on was so great that they couldn't afford to pay it back. And then they eventually collapsed in because they could not roll the debt. They could not roll the debt at the current interest rates. They got stuck and boom, and down it came. So now let's talk about Powell and Yellen back again and Mnuchin's exit. So Powell's political standing in Washington had never been higher. His fortune seems to rise even higher in November when President Trump lost his bid for re-election to the Democrat Joe Biden, the former vice president. Word soon leaked out that Biden's pick for Treasury Secretary was Powell's former boss and colleague, Janet Yellen. Experts in D.C. expected that the Fed and the White House would now have one of the most cooperative relationships in recent memory. On the way out of office, Trump's administration had a final spat with the Fed. Mnuchin, who had worked so closely with Powell, announced that the Treasury would no longer support the special purpose vehicles the Treasury and the Fed had created together, like the program that bought corporate junk debt. The vehicles would be closed down at the end of the year. The Federal Reserve opposed this move and released a statement saying as much, but Mnuchin said that his reasoning was simple. The CARES Act specifically said that the Fed's emergency SPVs should close at the end of 2020. There seemed to be little reason to extend the programs now that markets for stocks and corporate bonds were booming. I had every intention of following what I saw as the clear interpretation of the law, Mnuchin later said. The Fed pressed Mnuchin to keep the facilities open in case markets reversed, but he felt that doing so would come with a cost. The downside was that some future Treasury security is going to have to go back to Congress at some point in the next 100 years and ask for these kinds of emergency programs. And I think the fact that I was a good steward of this and gave back the capital as the law was written will be a good precedent for future Treasury secretaries. When Mnuchin announced that the program would close, it did not disrupt the booming market for corporate debt or stocks. Investors had seen that the Fed would intervene on their behalf, and that was apparently enough to keep them optimistic. So, again, I think in retrospect, I think that was a good move on the part of Mnuchin to close that down, because obviously the Fed's like, hey, man, we're just keeping everything. We're just keeping the party rolling in perpetuity. They're not slowing down for nothing. So I think ultimately in retrospect that was pretty much a good move on Mnuchin's part. Okay, now did the Fed fuel an asset bubble? So the next month, millions of traders on the retail platform Robinhood helped drive up shares in a video game rental company called GameStop. Okay, now we're back to the GameStop stuff again. The company's rising share value was puzzling when compared against its underlying economic health. The storefront business was suffering massive losses of customer traffic during the coronavirus lockdowns. It was arguably being made technologically obsolete by internet streaming. Its stock was jumping by double digits. During a news conference in late January, Jay Powell was asked repeatedly about the possibility that the Fed was fueling an asset bubble. Well, no, absolutely not. Inside the FOMC meetings, the Fed's own experts talked repeatedly about the ways that quantitative easing boosted all asset prices along with the stock market. Powell said that the Fed was monitoring asset prices but wasn't overly concerned. When he was pressed on the topic, he seemed almost exasperated. I think that the connection between low interest rates and asset values is probably something that's not as tight as people think, because a lot of different factors are driving asset prices at any given time, he said. I'm going to call hogwash on that. That's a bunch of nonsense. He knew, he had been warned repeatedly. We talked about this earlier in the book. He knew what was going on. He knew the ramifications of his actions, and he basically chose to ignore that. And basically just to, hey man, we got to keep the party rolling. So now, as we come to the end here, we're gonna check in with Tom Honig, our hero, as it were, of the story, and we're gonna see what Tom has been up to since he left the FDIC. So Tom spent the long winter of 2020 and 2021, as so many people did, in isolation. Instead of visiting his grandchildren, he saw them through FaceTime chats. Once the weather got cold in Kansas City, Tom and Cynthia, his wife, spent a lot of time around the house and rarely saw their friends. They figured out the little tricks of survival in the new world, like determining that the best time to do grocery shopping was on Wednesday afternoon at about 3 o'clock when no one else seemed to be at the store. They wore double layered face masks as they walked through the grocery aisles, which were now marked one way, and they stood a respectful distance from the cashier at the checkout counter, who wore a plastic face visor. One thing that kept Tom going was the feeling that he could do useful work. In the mornings, he woke up early and read the news on his iPad. He kept up with the Fed's actions through the coverage in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, among other publications. He spent a lot of time in his home office writing essays and opinion pieces that offered his best perspective on what the Fed and the bank regulators ought to be doing. He published some of these essays in Discourse, an online publication of the Mercatus Center think tank, where he was a senior fellow. In May of 2020, Tom published an essay urging people to think about what the Fed's actions during the crisis might mean over the long term. Emergency spending was vital to fighting the pandemic, he wrote. These policies, while necessary in the short term, place an ever larger mortgage against the nation's future income, and extending them beyond the crisis period could have significant negative unintended consequences. Tom had made a similar argument in 2010. He was saying that the United States needed to think about what it was going to do when the immediate crisis was over. Would the country use democratically elected institutions to confront its problems, or would it rely on its central bank once again? When Tom went on his long spree of dissenting votes in 2010, the Fed's balance sheet had been $2.3 trillion. That was a radically high amount by historical standards and was more than twice the size of the balance sheet before the 2008 financial crisis. In May of 2020, the Fed's balance sheet was $7 trillion, and continuing to grow under the near permanent flow of quantitative easing. Tom's warnings in 2020 were different in one important way from the warnings a decade earlier. Now he could point to the historical record. In his essay, Tom compared the period of economic growth between 2010 and 2018 with the period a decade earlier, between 1992 and 2000. These periods were comparable because they were both long periods of economic stability after a recession, he argued. In the 1990s, labor productivity in the United States increased at an annual average rate of 2.3%. During the decade of ZIRP, it rose by only 1.1%. Real median weekly earnings for wage and salary employees rose by 0.7% on average annually during the 1990s, but rose by only 0.26% during the 2010s. Average real GDP growth, a measure of the overall economy, rose an average of 3.8% annually during the 1990s, but by only 2.3% during the recent decade. The only part of the economy that seemed to benefit under ZIRP was the market for assets. The stock market more than doubled in value during the 2010s. Even after the crash of 2020, the markets continued their stellar growth and returns. Tom wasn't optimistic about what American life might look like after another decade of weak growth, wage stagnation, and booming asset values that primarily benefited the rich. This was something he talked about a lot, both publicly and privately. In his mind, economics and the banking system were tightly intertwined with American society. One thing affected the other. When the financial system benefited only a handful of people, average people started to lose faith in society as a whole. When they saw the biggest banks get bailed out while middle-class wages faltered, it made people feel like the system was rigged. Tom argued in public speeches that this was a good reason to pursue bank reform. Over coffee at a bakery in downtown Washington in 2019, Tom said that the misallocation of resources under ZIRP was very likely contributed to the undercurrents tearing apart American society. Do you think that we would have had the political, shall we say, turmoil, revolution we had in 2016 had we not had this great divide not been created? Had we not had the effects of the zero interest rates that benefited some far more than others? Tom asked. I don't know. It's a counterfactual, but it's a question I would like to pose. And I think Tom is 100% right in his assessment. In 2021, as he sat at home in Kansas City, Tom seemed interested in talking about one issue above all. It was the need for long-term thinking. He recalled a piece of advice he had gotten from a Swiss central banker that always stuck with him. We are responsible for the long run, so the short run can take care of itself. The central banker had said, the Fed was supposed to be an ideal institution for long-term thinking because it was insulated from voters and elections. But Tom didn't believe that long-term thinking dominated the decisions of 2010 or beyond. The short run was the focal point, he said. This wasn't just a problem that afflicted central bankers. It seemed to increasingly dominate the thinking of corporations, government institutions, and the concerns of average citizens. Everyone had a short-term need that makes the long-term impossible to look to, Tom said. This mattered a lot because long-term thinking would be indispensable to confronting America's economic problems in 2021. The financial crash that happened in the spring of 2020 was smothered so rapidly by so much new money from the Fed that most people didn't know it had happened. But the consequences of the crash were dire. On the morning of March 11, 2021, as Tom was reading the Wall Street Journal, he came across a particularly alarming story. Like so much of the important news about America's money and debt, this article carried a seemingly benign headline: Wave of New Debt to Test Treasury Market. The story explained the deep vulnerability roiling beneath the surface of a financial system that seemed to be going smoothly. This vulnerability was not new, and it had to do with the very delicate balance on the financial seesaw of risk. The safe side of the seesaw held reliable assets like treasury bills. The other side of the seesaw held risky assets like stocks and corporate debt. The Fed was pumping $80 billion a month into the safe side of the seesaw by purchasing treasury bills, which in turn depressed the interest rates or yield on those bills. As had been happening for a decade, this forced investors to push their money to the riskier side, seeking yield. Something worrisome started to happen in March. Treasury interest rates had started to climb regardless of the Fed's intervention. There were lots of reasons for the yields to rise. Investors expected the economy to grow, which pushed up rates, for example. But the Journal article highlighted another potentially more dangerous reason: the sheer amount of debt the U.S. government was issuing. President Trump and the Republicans in Congress had passed a tax cut in 2017 that forced the government to borrow $1 trillion every year to keep the government running, even when the economy was at its peak in 2019. When the pandemic hit, Congress approved more than $2 trillion in spending in the CARES Act alone, all of it financed by deficit spending. In March, President Biden signed a new $1.9 trillion rescue package. This was heralded as the first major rescue bill in decades that steered the majority of its spending to poor and working class people. All of this meant that the U.S. Treasury would be selling about $2.8 trillion in Treasury bills during 2021. The Journal article documented the troubling fact that there might not be enough demand for all that debt to keep Treasury interest rates down at the low levels where the Fed has been pushing them. Demand was worryingly soft during a couple of Treasury bill auctions that month. Analysts believed there might be a buyer strike for some Treasury bills, which would require the government to pay higher interest rates to entice buyers. If Treasury rates rose, all that investment cash on Wall Street would be enticed to move toward the safe end of the seesaw, finding shelter in the higher, safer yields that had been denied for so long. This would drain cash out of the markets for leveraged loans, stocks, CLOs, and all the risky structures that Wall Street had been busily building for many years. Powell and his team would then face a familiar choice. They could let the risky structures fall or intervene once again with more quantitative easing and emergency programs. Powell faced a similar choice when money rushed out of risky assets in late 2018, and he chose the path of creating more money to soothe markets. This encouraged more speculation and asset inflation. Tom believed that the Fed would almost certainly once again choose the path of money creation if debt prices rose and markets teetered. You see the complications we're building for ourselves going forward, Tom said. Now, all right, here's where I want to take a break for just a second because we're almost done here. Everything that they just described about the Treasury market is what? It's playing out right now. We are literally watching this today. It is getting harder and harder for the Treasury to go and sell their Treasury bills, especially the longer T-bills, the 10-year T-bills, the 30-year T-bills. They're having a very hard time selling these. So what are they doing? They're rolling the debt every 60 days, every 90 days. You could see that the higher interest rates are all on the lower end of the scale. The 30, the 60, the 90, the 1 year, the 2 year, the 5 year. Those interest rates are all way higher. The yield curve has been dramatically inverted for almost several years now. I think it's been inverted for 600 days. It's the longest and deepest inversion on record. But sooner or later, the Fed has been doing all these things to keep the yield curve inverted, to keep things the way that they are now, because they know that once that inversion goes back, those rates are going to spike, because it's a risk reward. Just what they said here is the seesaw of risk in the economy, that basically analysts believe there might be a buyer strike for some treasury bills, which would require the government to pay higher interest rates to entice buyers. Yes, absolutely. If treasury rates rose, all that investment cash on Wall Street would be enticed to move toward the safe end of the seesaw, finding shelter in the higher, safer yields that have been denied for so long. Isn't that exactly what has been happening for the last 2 years? This would drain cash out of the markets for leveraged loans, stocks, CLOs, and all the risky structures that Wall Street had been busily building for many years. That is exactly what's happening right now. But where it's really acute is in the repo market. If you look at the cash in the repo market, it has plunged down to, I think it's under 500 million. In wait till the last episode of the series here, in episode 21, I'm going to show all of these charts. I'm going to show all this. I'm going to show the repo market. I'm going to show the Fed's balance sheet. I'm going to show interest rates. We're going to go over all this stuff, and I'm going to bring this whole thing together for you. So, okay, so let's finish here. Last couple paragraphs. So Tom kept churning out his essays and his white papers. He was 74 years old, and at the end of his career, his ideas didn't seem much more popular than they were before. His papers were not read widely. He was rarely invited to speak on cable news shows, but Tom's arguments were as relevant in 2021 as they were a decade earlier. This didn't reflect the consistency of his views so much as the intricability of America's long-term problems. In many important ways, the financial crash of 2008 had never ended. It was a long crash that crippled the economy for years. The problems that caused it went almost entirely unsolved. And this financial crash was compounded by a long crash in the strength of America's democratic institutions. When America relied on the Federal Reserve to address its economic problems, it relied on a deeply flawed tool. All the Fed's money only widened the distance between America's winners and losers and laid the foundation for more instability. This fragile financial system was wrecked by the pandemic, and in response, the Fed created yet more new money, amplifying the earlier distortions. The long crash of 2008 had evolved into the long crash of 2020. The bills had yet to be paid. And there it is, my friends. That is the end. We have reached the end. I will have more thoughts in the final 2 episodes here. So episode 20 is just going to be a recap of part 3, the last 4 chapters of the book. I just did that because I think episode 8 was a recap of part 1, and then episode 15 was a recap of part 2 of the book. So I figured I'd do one more recap of the last 4 chapters. And then the final episode in this series, episode number 21, is like I said, I'm going to go through and I'm going to kind of bring this all together. I'm going to bring some current articles. I'm going to bring a bunch of charts and figures, and we're going to take kind of a look back over the last 15, 16 years, and we're going to see basically all the damage that the Fed has wrought here and how they have completely, they've turned this, what they have done is they've turned it into the all bailout, everything is a bubble economy. That's what they've done. And they've completely, in a very real sense, they've kind of bastardized our entire financial system. And I think that Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and Jeremy Powell are all 3 of their legacies are tied together. They've been the 3 Fed chairmen that have presided over this whole period. I think that good or bad, their legacies like a chain are all going to go down together. And history, I think history will show that in the decades to come. It'll take some time. It'll take some time. Like I said, I think that 10, 20, 30 years from now, when this history is written and we look back on this period, I don't think that people are going to look back on any of these Fed chairmen in a very favorable light. I think that they are going to be looked very down upon. I think that their track records are going to be just lambasted. And yeah, I don't think history is going to judge them very kindly. That's my opinion. That's my take on it. I would just like to say a couple things in closing here. I would like to thank Christopher Leonard, for the author of this book, for just writing an absolute gem of a book here about the Fed, about everything that transpired here. I thank him for giving Tom Honig a voice. I would like to say thank you to Tom Honig. I hope he's out there. I hope maybe one day he actually, maybe somebody tells him about this some way, somehow, and that he's actually able to listen to this. Because he was right. He was right about everything that he said. He was about everything that he espoused. And, you know, and it's a very difficult thing. Like I said, Monday, but, you know, playing Monday morning quarterback, it can be a difficult thing, because in the moment when everybody's yelping at you and everybody wants you to do something to bail them out, it's hard to say no to that. It's hard to say no to that. And you don't want to be the one sitting there picking winners and losers per se. So it's a difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing. But I think that, you know, I think, like I said, but I think that Tom was right. I think he was right in his assessment. I think that we go back a couple chapters ago when he said that, you know, Tom said that Fed's trapped. And I believe that to be very true. I believe that they are trapped by everything that they have done here. So again, I mean, we'll have to see how a lot of this stuff plays out. But again, you know, thank you to Christopher Leonard. Thank you for writing this magnificent book. I give you all the kudos in the world, sir. You did an absolutely fantastic job. I'd like to thank all of the listeners and everybody who has kind of stuck with me here throughout this series. We're not quite done yet. Still have 2 more episodes yet to go. But we're almost done there. So like I said, just hang in there with me for 2 more episodes, and yeah, we'll go from there. But again, if you enjoyed this, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. That always helps the channel. That will always help this series in particular. And I will be back to see everybody again real soon. Thanks a lot.